A vessel so secret that only 2 photographs were ever taken of her during construction. So massive that she dwarfed every aircraft carrier that came before her. And so cursed that she survived barely 19 hours after leaving port. This is the story of the Shinano, Japan's phantom supercarrier, a floating fortress built in desperation and destroyed by a single enemy submarine that had no idea what it was shooting at. What you're about to hear is the tale of the largest aircraft carrier ever sunk, a ship whose very existence was denied by her creators, even as she slipped beneath the waves, taking with her over 1,400 souls and the last desperate hopes of a dying empire. Welcome to the Twilight Front, where history's most extraordinary stories come alive. The year was 1944, and the Imperial Japanese Navy was drowning in desperation. American B-29 superfortresses roared through Japanese skies like mechanical dragons, raining fire and steel on cities below. In the Philippines, the rising sun flag was being torn down as U.S. troops reclaimed territory inch by bloody inch. The empire that had once stretched across the Pacific like a great shadow was shrinking, and the admirals in Tokyo knew it. In the depths of their naval planning rooms, maps spread across mahogany tables told a story of retreat and loss. The black pins marking Japanese positions grew fewer each week, while the red markers of American forces crept ever closer to the homeland. Something had to be done, something bold, something revolutionary, something that would turn the tide of this seemingly endless war. Their answer would be a single ship, not just any ship, but a floating fortress so massive, so powerful, that its very existence would strike terror into the hearts of their enemies. This would be the Shinano, Japan's secret supercarrier, a vessel born from desperation and shrouded in shadows. The story of the Shinano began not as a carrier, but as something else entirely. Deep in the Yokosuka Naval Shipyard, nestled in the protected waters of Tokyo Bay, construction had begun on what was meant to be the 3rd member of Japan's mighty battleship trinity, joining the already legendary Yamato and Musashi. These were to be the largest, most heavily armed battleships the world had ever seen, floating mountains of steel that would dominate any surface engagement. But fate, as it often does in wartime, had other plans. On June 4th, 1942, in the crystal-clear waters near a small atoll called Midway, the unthinkable happened. In a single day of savage air combat, Japan lost 4 of its premier aircraft carriers: Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. The cream of their naval aviation, pilots who had trained for years and possessed skills honed in the crucible of China and Pearl Harbor, went down with their ships or died in the cold Pacific waters. The loss was catastrophic. In the conference rooms of the Naval General Staff, the mood was funeral. Admiral Yamamoto himself, the architect of Pearl Harbor, knew that Japan had just lost the war's initiative. The carrier force that had been the spearhead of their Pacific conquest was crippled, and with it, their ability to project power across the vast ocean. It was then that someone, history doesn't record exactly who, looked at the construction plans for the 3rd Yamato-class battleship and asked the question that would change everything. What if we made it into a carrier instead? The transformation of the Shinano from battleship to supercarrier required more than just architectural changes. It demanded absolute secrecy. The Japanese High Command understood that if the Americans caught even a whisper of what they were building, bombers would rain down on Yokosuka before the ship could ever taste salt water. Around Dry Dock Number 6, concrete walls rose like prison barriers, topped with a solid roof that blocked any view from above. The shipyard workers, many of whom had families in the surrounding neighborhoods, found themselves virtual prisoners during their 16-hour shifts. Armed guards patrolled the perimeter, their orders clear and uncompromising. No one entered who didn't belong, and no one left until their shift was complete. Inside those walls, something unprecedented was taking shape. The workers, sworn to silence under threat of imprisonment, or worse, labored around the clock. Welding sparks illuminated their faces in the dim, enclosed space as they worked to create what would become the largest aircraft carrier in the world. The heat was stifling, the air thick with metal dust and the acrid smell of molten steel, but the work continued, The secrecy was so complete that the Shinano became one of the only major warships of the 20th century never to be professionally photographed during construction. Only 2 images would ever surface. One taken by a daring reconnaissance aircraft from nearly 2 miles up, and another snapped by a civilian on a tugboat who happened to witness the ship's first tentative movements in the harbor. Workers who had toiled on her construction for months spoke of her only in whispers, even among themselves. They called her the ship with no name, or simply her, as if speaking her actual designation might somehow summon American bombers from the sky. When the Shinano finally emerged from her steel cocoon, she was a sight to behold. At 872 feet long, nearly 3 football fields end to end, she stretched across the water like a floating city. Her displacement of over 69,000 tons made her heavier than many buildings, and her deck could accommodate 2,400 crew members and officers. But the Shinano was no ordinary carrier. Her designers had learned bitter lessons from the losses at Midway and the Philippine Sea. This ship was built like a fortress, with armor thick enough to shrug off bombs that would cripple lesser vessels. Her 16 dual-purpose guns could reach out over 14 miles, each capable of firing 8 rounds per minute. Clusters of anti-aircraft guns bristled from her superstructure like deadly flowers, ready to fill the sky with steel. Yet for all her offensive capabilities, the Shinano's true purpose was more complex. She was designed as a support carrier, a floating depot that could fuel, arm, and repair Japan's remaining carrier fleet. In her cavernous holds, she could carry not just aircraft, but the infrastructure of naval aviation itself, spare parts, fuel, ammunition, and even aircraft engines. She was meant to be the backbone of a resurgent carrier force. As autumn turned to winter in 1944, the great ship neared completion. But even as the final rivets were driven home, dark omens began to gather. October 8th, 1944, dawned gray and overcast over Tokyo Bay. The Shinano was scheduled for her first launch, not her maiden voyage, but the moment when she would first kiss the waters that would become her domain. The massive caisson that had kept the dry dock dry for so long groaned under the weight of millions of gallons of seawater as it was slowly opened. Then disaster struck. The caisson, weighing 5,000 tons and engineered to withstand tremendous pressure, suddenly gave way with a sound like thunder. Water roared into the dry dock in a torrent, lifting the massive carrier and slamming her against the headwall with tremendous force. Over 100 mooring lines snapped like guitar strings as the ship bucked and rolled in the churning water. For terrifying minutes, the Shinano thrashed like a living thing, her hull scraping against the concrete walls as water levels inside and outside the dock fought to equalize. Workers scattered in panic, some diving into the water to avoid being crushed by the massive chains and cables whipping through the air. When the chaos finally subsided, the damage was clear. The ship's bow was crumpled, and repairs would take weeks. But the physical damage was nothing compared to the psychological impact. Japanese sailors were deeply superstitious, and to them the accident was an unmistakable omen. The ship was cursed, they whispered. She was destined for disaster. Finding replacement workers became nearly impossible. Men who had eagerly sought positions on the great ship now found reasons to decline. Those who remained worked with a cloud of dread hanging over them, jumping at every unusual sound, every groan of metal that might signal another catastrophe. Despite the delays and the growing sense of foreboding, the Japanese Navy pressed forward. American forces were advancing too quickly to allow for proper testing and preparation. The planned completion date of April 1945 had already been moved up to October 1944, but even that seemed too far away as reports came in of American victories across the Pacific. Captain Toshio Abe, a veteran naval officer with weathered hands and eyes that had seen too much war, was given command of the Shinano. From the moment he stepped aboard, he knew something was wrong. The ship felt unfinished, incomplete in ways that went beyond missing equipment or unpainted surfaces. His concerns were specific and alarming. The watertight compartments that were supposed to make the ship unsinkable had never been properly tested. Standard air pressure tests, routine for any seagoing vessel, had been skipped in the rush to launch. The elaborate passage system that ran the length of the ship, designed for efficiency, had never been drilled by the crew. If something went wrong, if they needed to evacuate quickly, his men would be wandering through unfamiliar corridors in the dark. Even more troubling were the mechanical issues. Of the 12 boilers that powered the massive ship, only 8 were operational, and only 6 were actually running. Electrical cables ran through unsealed holes in bulkheads, fire suppression systems lacked pumps, and the crew, experienced though they were, had never trained together as a unit on this particular ship. Captain Abe requested an extension, time to properly test his ship and train his crew. The request was denied. On November 28, 1944, ready or not, the Shinano would sail. As the sun set over Tokyo Bay on November 28, 1944, the Shinano prepared for her maiden voyage. Her destination was the port of Kure, where she would receive final equipment and supplies before heading to the Philippines. It should have been a routine journey, 16 hours along the Japanese coast, well within friendly waters. Aboard the great ship, 2,175 crew members went about their duties with the practiced efficiency of the Imperial Navy. Another 300 shipyard workers remained aboard, still making last-minute adjustments, while 40 civilians, officials, and observers watched from the bridge as Japan's latest weapon prepared to enter the war. The ship's cargo was as impressive as her size. In her holds rested 6 Ginyu boats, small submarines designed for coastal defense, and 50 Oka rocket-powered kamikaze planes. These were weapons of desperation, suicide machines that spoke to how far Japan had fallen from the confident aggressor of Pearl Harbor. As the Shinano slipped her moorings and moved into the darkening waters of Tokyo Bay, her escort destroyers fell into formation around her. The Isokaze, Hamikaze, and Yukikaze, ships that had survived the hell of Leyte Gulf just days before, took their positions. Their crews were exhausted, their ships bearing the scars of recent battle, but they were all Japan could spare. The great ship moved through the water with surprising grace for something so massive. Her engines hummed deep in her hull, pushing her through the gentle swells at a steady pace. On her bridge, Captain Abe watched the coastline slip by and tried to shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. 60 feet beneath the dark waters of the Pacific, USS Archerfish prowled like a mechanical shark. Commander Joseph Enright, her captain, had been hunting in these waters for days, searching for targets worthy of his torpedoes. The submarine was a veteran of the Pacific War, her hull scarred by depth charges, and her crew seasoned by months of dangerous patrols in enemy waters. At 8:48 p.m., the sonar operator's voice cut through the submarine's humid air. Contact bearing 020, multiple screws, heavy machinery noise. On the radar screen, a cluster of blips appeared, 1 large, 3 smaller. Enright studied the display with the calm intensity of a hunter who had found his prey. The large contact was massive, unlike anything the Archerfish had encountered before. Whatever it was important enough to raid a destroyer escort, and in these waters, that meant it was worth killing. For the next hour and a half, the submarine shadowed its quarry, maintaining a parallel course while staying just out of detection range. The Japanese ships were moving in a zigzag pattern, a standard anti-submarine tactic, but they were moving slowly enough that the Archerfish could keep pace. The discovery of the American submarine should have been the end of the hunt. The Shinano was faster than any submarine, capable of outrunning her pursuer with ease. But the great ship was still following an evasive zigzag course designed to avoid other submarines that might be lurking in the area. This pattern slowed her to barely 15 knots, exactly the maximum speed of the hunting Archerfish. Captain Abe, standing on his bridge with the cool night air washing over him, made a series of decisions that would prove fatal. When the destroyer Isokaze broke formation to investigate the submarine contact, Abe ordered her back. He was convinced this was a trap, that the lone submarine was trying to draw away his escorts so a wolf pack could attack his valuable ship. It was a reasonable fear, but a fatal mistake. There was no wolf pack. There was only Commander Enright and his crew, alone in the dark waters and growing more confident by the hour that they had found something extraordinary. As the night wore on, the bizarre chase continued. The Archerfish followed, neither closing nor falling back, while the Japanese ships maintained their defensive formation. Hours passed with both sides watching and waiting, like gunfighters circling each other in the street. Then, at 3 a.m., Captain Abe made his final, fatal error. Perhaps tired of the cat-and-mouse game, perhaps convinced he had lost his pursuer, he ordered a course change to the southwest. The great ship turned, presenting her massive profile to the submarine that had been stalking her all night. Commander Enright couldn't believe his luck. The target had turned directly across his submarine's bow, giving him the perfect shot. In the cramped torpedo room, his crew prepared 6 Mark 14 torpedoes, each carrying 643 pounds of Torpex explosive. The submarine's computers calculated speed, bearing, and range with mechanical precision. At 3:17 a.m., Enright gave the order. Fire 1, Fire 2, Fire 3, Fire 4, Fire 5, Fire 6.
The 6 torpedoes streaked through the black water like underwater meteors, their electric motors driving them toward the massive target at 46 knots. 4 of them found their mark, striking the Shinano's starboard side in a devastating sequence that lasted less than 30 seconds. The first torpedo struck the stern, tearing open storage compartments and flooding the sleeping quarters where hundreds of men lay in their bunks. The explosion shook the entire ship, throwing men from their beds and sending equipment crashing across compartments. The second torpedo hit the engine room, rupturing steam lines and flooding the space with superheated water and metal fragments. The third found the boiler rooms, knocking out power to huge sections of the ship and filling critical spaces with the Pacific Ocean. The fourth torpedo, perhaps the most damaging of all, struck the starboard air compressor room and ruptured a fuel tank, sending thousands of gallons of oil spilling into the ship's lower decks. Captain Abe, thrown against the bridge railing by the force of the explosions, struggled to assess the damage. His first instinct was denial. American torpedoes were notorious for their unreliability, and surely his massive, heavily armored ship could withstand a few hits. He kept the Shinano at maximum speed, not realizing that this decision was driving thousands of gallons of seawater deeper into his ship with every passing minute. But the Shinano had been designed as a battleship, not a carrier. Her internal layout, meant to withstand the stresses of heavy guns, was not optimized for damage control in a carrier configuration. The torpedo hits had opened her to the sea in ways her designers had never anticipated. As dawn approached on November 29th, the reality of the situation became undeniable. The Shinano was dying. Her massive bulk was settling deeper into the water with each passing minute, and her list to starboard was growing more pronounced. Captain Abe, his uniform soaked with spray and his face etched with the terrible knowledge of defeat, made the hardest decision of his career. At 5 a.m., he ordered the 40 civilians evacuated to the escort destroyers. Officially, they were in the way of damage control efforts. In reality, Abe knew his ship was doomed and was trying to save who he could. The crew fought valiantly to save their ship. Pumps roared in flooded compartments, damage control teams sealed what holes they could, and the ship's carpenter measured the flooding with growing alarm. But it was too late. The torpedo damage was too extensive, the flooding too severe. At 7 a.m., in desperation, Abe ordered the destroyers to attempt towing the great ship to safety. Heavy cables were passed between the vessels, and the smaller ships strained against their burden. But the Shinano displaced nearly 70,000 tons. She was simply too massive. The cables snapped like threads, and the destroyers fell back, helpless. By 9 a.m., all electrical power was lost. The great ship went dark. Her ventilation systems fell silent. And in the stuffy compartments below, men worked by flashlight and lantern.
At 10:18 a.m., 17 hours after beginning her maiden voyage, Captain Abe gave the order no naval commander ever wants to give. Abandon ship. The Shinano rolled over and slipped beneath the waves at 10:57 a.m., taking with her the dreams of a desperate empire and the lives of over 1,400 men. She had been operational for exactly 19 hours. The sinking of the Shinano represents more than just a military victory or defeat. It stands as a testament to what happens when nations, driven by desperation, abandon careful planning for rushed gambles. The great ship, which might have been a formidable weapon if properly built and tested, instead became a victim of her creator's haste. In the end, the Shinano's story is one of wasted potential and tragic irony. Japan's largest aircraft carrier never carried a single aircraft into combat. Their most heavily armed escort vessel never fired a shot in anger. Their most secret weapon was destroyed by an enemy who didn't even know what he was shooting at. The wreck of the Shinano lies today in deep Pacific waters, a steel tomb holding the dreams of an empire and the bodies of men who deserved better than to die aboard a ship that should never have sailed. She remains a reminder that in war as in life, there are no shortcuts to victory, and desperation is a poor substitute for preparation. In those dark waters off the Japanese coast, the Shinano keeps her secrets still, a monument to the folly of rushing into battle before you're ready to fight. This is Kenneth Richards with the Twilight Front.